Hello, and thanks very much for joining me today. So my name's Sheila Gilheany. I'm from Alcohol Action Ireland. And today I wanted to talk to you a bit about industry influence on government policy, what we're seeing here in Ireland, and some suggestions about what might be possible to try and reduce the impact of industry influence. So, as hopefully quite a few of you might know, there has been progress being made here in Ireland. We have some progressive legislation that was passed back in 2018. It includes some modest measures. It has things like minimum unit pricing. We have some restrictions on alcohol advertising. We have separation of alcohol in shops, supermarkets. And coming next year, we'll have a really important measure which will give health information labelling on all alcohol products. So definitely some progress there. But I have to say, we are a bit worried that we're seeing some stalling of that progress. Now, part of that has been to do with the really very slow implementation of this legislation. It was passed in 2018, and here we are 7 years on and still not fully implemented, and some bits not even with an implementation date coming yet. It's also being somewhat undermined by 0.0 alcohol product workarounds, which we would consider quite cynical. There's some things that aren't addressed at all, like, for example, online advertising. But I would say mostly what we are most concerned about is that there are competing alcohol policies which are coming from other departments other than the Department of Health. So just for example, from the Departments of Justice, from Finance, and indeed others. To give you a couple of examples of these, we have a proposal from the Department of Justice that licensing hours should be extended. And this is despite all the evidence that tells us that if you extend licensing hours, you're likely to see an increase in alcohol consumption, and with that, an increase in alcohol-related harm. Just giving you a few examples of some of the evidence that we have been gathering on that. But I suppose really the question is, where did the proposal to actually extend licensing hours, where did it come out of? And kind of it takes us back a couple of years, back to 2021, and there was a report that came from the Department of Media in this particular case. They had set up a task force which was all about revitalising the nighttime economy. But what I find of interest is that when you look at the makeup of the task force itself, it had many representatives from government departments. Practically every government department, whether it was from Justice, whether it was from Enterprise, whether we were talking about arts, culture, there was representation. The one department that wasn't represented in this was the Department of Health, or indeed any kind of public health input at all. And so it's not surprising that the net result of that was a strong recommendation to increase licensing hours. And then another department, Department of Justice, takes that on board because they're the department that look after licensing and put forward these proposals. Now, they haven't been implemented yet. It's still in the early stages of legislation. But it goes against the grain. It goes against what was the impetus from the Department of Health, that we should be seeking to reduce alcohol consumption. Another example, this time from Department of Agriculture. So again, a few years back ago, there was a decision made that we needed to have a policy on how best to produce food in Ireland so that it would be sustainable. And what came out of that was quite a long, detailed document called Food Vision 2030. But again, if we look at who is actually on the committee that brought about this set of recommendations, I won't say hidden because it's right in the middle there. You might notice Oliver Looms, who is the chair of IBEC and Drinks Ireland, that particular division. And even more importantly, he's also director and chair of Diageo. Now, you might be saying, I thought this was about food. And you would really have to say, is alcohol a food? And by any definition, it's not a food, but it's even by the alcohol industry's own definition, it's not a food. And the way I know that is that if you look at EU legislation, which is about the labelling of food products. So, for example, if you lift any food product sold in the EU, it will have information on calories, it'll have information on the ingredients in the food. And the one exception to that is alcohol. So it is apparently not a food when it comes to that particular case. But when we look actually at the report, and there were all sorts of glowing insights into basically how wonderful the alcohol industry is here in Ireland. And they particularly were pointing out issues that pointed to how sustainable the way in which alcohol was being produced. And I find this actually particularly interesting because alcohol, we know, is in fact a barrier to many of the sustainable goals that have been set by the United Nations. So I really know that the alcohol industry itself knows it's on thin ice on this particular thing. So they're always very keen to kind of flout, or to flaunt, I should say, their own credentials in this particular space. But apart from that, one of the other recommendations that came out of this particular report was to do with harmonisation of food labelling. And indeed, there was a discussion about the need for front of pack nutrition labelling. But you'll notice the caveat that was put in here that yes, grand to have this labelling, but we shouldn't have any unintended barriers to trade. Well, we would certainly look at a recommendation that's coming from this particular department and say, is this now in conflict with the recommendation and what is now the policy of the Department of Health to have alcohol product labelling with health warnings on it? So again, there's this tension that's arising between different departments. Looking at another particular set of recommendations that came out of Food Vision Ireland, we could look at a thing called the Ireland Strategic Investment Fund. So this is a vehicle that the government use for putting investments that are considered important for the country. And the fund, you know, is quite careful about where it invests. It has particular targets, it has particular issues and things that it wants to look at. So for example, it doesn't invest in fossil fuels because of a recognition of the impact of fossil fuels on our climate. There's other things around housing and Indigenous businesses are wanting to support them. But when it comes to food and agriculture, one of the defining ways in which it decided and how it would make investments was to use Food Vision 2030. Now, it's interesting that the fund will not invest in tobacco, but funny enough, it will invest in alcohol. And we would see this as very much flowing from the kind of recommendations that was coming from Food Vision. And that we can now see has led to many investments by the state in the alcohol industry. We did a measure of this a couple of years back ago and found that over the past decade that about 115 million euros worth by the state had been invested in industry in one shape or another, whether it was through tax breaks or direct grants, or, as I say, specific investments that might be held. I'm actually just taking a look at one of those particular grants that we saw. So Enterprise Ireland recently made an investment in Diageo, gave them 7.5 million. And along, of course, with that was not only was the investment being made, and we would really have to say, why on earth would the government feel the need to invest in a company that is already a very, very wealthy company, as opposed to, for example, investing in a small local business that could be doing with that money. But apart from that altogether, we could see that one of the opportunities that came out of that for Diageo was certainly lots of photo ops with senior politicians, a few of them being pictured here, but also that it was kind of giving them credentials, I suppose, about sustainability, about saying, well, this product is now being made in a greener way, a more sustainable way. When in fact, actually, the greener, more sustainable thing to do with alcohol production is actually to produce less of it, not to be producing it in some apparently greener fashion. So what do we think might be helpful in this way? Alcohol Action Ireland is putting forward the idea that we need a framework which would guide all government interactions with health harming industries. We obviously see alcohol in this particular way, but we would say that it also applies to other health harming industries, like, for example, unhealthy foods, highly processed foods. Because what tends to happen is you get one commission being set up, and you get kind of alcohol influence being put in that. You get another policy coming out of another department, and there's a bit of alcohol influence going in there. But there's no overarching look at how we should be dealing, what should be guiding our interactions with these health harming industries. So a framework would be at least a start. And I suppose from an alcohol perspective, we would say there is a need for a one-stop shop, one single department that really would look at all aspects of alcohol policy. That's just a flavour of some of the things that we've been looking at recently. You can check out our website for a bit more. And in particular, I'd invite you to take a look at a section that we have called Industry Watch. And what we're doing is kind of like putting a spotlight on some of these areas of interest that show the way in which the industry operates and how, in fact, it's up to, I suppose, all of us here in this public health space to try and ameliorate that by pointing out some of the difficulties that come into operation. I'll leave you with that. And one last thing, I'm always aware that when we're talking about alcohol, that it can arouse very difficult feelings from people. So a couple of helplines and some sources of support. Thanks very much.